everybody for joining us again today. My name is Chris Richmond. I'm with ICF. We're a technical assistance provider for HUD, and today we are continuing on with our Lead Safe Housing Rule series, in particular Subpart J and K. Today we're going to finish up Subpart J, rehab, and we're going to be looking at the construction phase. So again, as I mentioned, my name is Chris. I'm accompanied again by my colleague, Les Warner. He's also with ICF. And we also have with us some HUD staff from the Office of Lead Hazard Control and Healthy Homes. We have Bruce Haber, we have Karen Griego, and we also have Jerry Freese. Sorry, Jerry, we didn't get your name up there. They're answering questions for us today through that Q&A box. You heard Paul tell you how to use the Q&A box. So please remember, questions about the content, put it in the Q&A. We quite often see a lot of the questions coming through the chat. Only use that chat if you can't hear us anymore or you're having trouble using the system. But questions about the training itself, please go into the Q&A box and ask those in the Q&A box. All right, so if you've been with us the last couple of weeks, you know this is a 4-week series. If you just joined us today, you have missed the first 2 weeks. You're welcome to stay with us, but you need to catch up, so you need to go back and listen to the first 2 weeks. We are going to go for about 2 hours today. We're going to take a break. Not exactly sure when we're going to take that break, but we are going to take a break at some point for you to be able to get up, go get a drink, water, use the restroom, so we can come back and focus again. And then tomorrow we're going to have our office hour session. It'll be at 1 o'clock Eastern time tomorrow. We're going to review the homework, so please make sure you spend some time this afternoon or tomorrow morning doing your homework. Your homework was posted. We're going to be doing exercise 3, occupant protection and construction monitoring. So please take some time to fill that out. And then tomorrow, we will go over the answers during our office hours, and then we'll answer any questions that you have that you'll be typing in, as well as taking those questions that came in today and putting them together in some different topic areas and reviewing those as well, because it's very difficult to listen to me, look at the slides, comprehend what we're talking about, as well as monitor the Q&A box. So there's a lot of great questions and answers flying back and forth, and we want to make sure that you have an opportunity to hear those, and so we'll be highlighting a number of those tomorrow during that office hour session as well. And then these links will be sent out to you from today as well as tomorrow's session so that you can go back. If you want to refresh your memory, listen to it again, or for some reason you have an appointment and you're not able to join us in any of these sessions, you can go back and listen to the recordings. Right, so today is session 3. We're going to be doing Subpart J, rehab requirements, construction and clearance. Next week, we will be getting into Subpart K. So that's acquisition, leasing, supportive services, and operation programs. You might hear Les and I refer to that as also. That's the shortcut name, the nickname we use for Subpart K. So we'll talk about Subpart K next week on the, looking at my calendar, the 24th. But today we're going to finish out Subpart J. Right, so there's a lot of material that we want to cover, and we're together for just a short time. So for this session, we're really going to try to focus on what are some tips for compliance with the Lead Safe Housing Rule, talk through some different critical decisions. We're going to go over key terms. We're also going to talk about resources. We're also going to review occupant protection and relocation. So we have a pretty big section in this series about that as well. All right, so as I mentioned when we got started, this is session 3, and rehab was 2 sessions, so 2 and 3. So we are continuing topics that we started and introduced in session 2. So it's really important if you missed session 2 to go back and listen to that, because we're not going to go into detail on a number of things. So we this week are talking about projects that trigger Lead Safe Housing Rule. Last time we talked quite a bit about what's exempt. We're not going to review exemptions at all this time. We're also taking the discussion of level of assistance to the next level. So level of assistance, which category do you fall into for rehab? Are you 5 and under? Are you over 5 to 25, or are you over 25,000? And what types of evaluation, what types of lead hazard control or abatement needs to be done, what kind of documentation needs to be done? We're going to be talking all about that as it relates to the different levels of assistance. So if you don't know how to determine those levels of assistance, go back and listen to session 2, because we went over quite a few slides and quite a few examples of how you determine what that level of assistance is. And then we also discussed in great detail EPA's RRP rule. That's the renovation, repair, and painting rule. Anytime you're doing lead hazard control work, you need to have RRP certified firms, contractors, workers, and so knowing what that is and what those requirements are, how to get that certification for your contractors, as well as what are a lot of the work requirements that are needed. Those were also reviewed in session 2. So you're welcome to stay with us if you missed the first 2, but please go back and bring yourself up to speed on those different topics. All right, so we want to start off with a poll. If we were all together, I'd say, hey, raise your hand, let me know what kind of programs you're operating, but since I can't see all of you, it's helpful if you just fill the poll out just so we get a sense of who's with us today. So if you could just, on the right-hand side of your screen, you should see the poll appearing, and if you could just click on which type of rehab program are you operating, that would be helpful for us to know.
The poll will be closing in 20 seconds.
Thanks, Paul. All right, let's see. It looks like a couple categories where we have quite a few people. We have about 96 of you who are just doing homeowner rehab. We have, where did my poll results go? There they are. Just a few of you doing rental rehab, only a few doing acquisition rehab, and then a number of you doing more than one. So it's probably likely ones doing more than one could be doing rental rehab as well as acquisition rehab, but a big group of you doing homeowner rehab. So that's pretty common of what we see when we do these trainings. Now this slide, you have seen it in all 3 sessions, so nothing has changed. It's just reminding you what HUD programs are triggering Subpart J. Again, not an exhaustive list, but we do see our CBG program, home program, housing trust fund, emergency shelter grants, housing opportunities for persons with AIDS. So these are all different examples of rehab programs that are triggering Subpart J. We did have last week a lot of public housing agencies that were on asking a lot of questions, but we're not using any of these types of federal funds. So just keep in mind, Subpart J, these are the typical programs that HUD is funding. If you are a public housing authority, you most likely will be following Subpart L, and we're going to be talking about Subpart J today. All right, so let's get started. So we're going to review implementation of the LSHCH housing rule and the various stages of review so your program can meet compliance with both HUD and EPA requirements. So as I said a little earlier, we are talking about these different levels. You see up to including under and up to including 5,000, 5 to 25,000, and over 25,000. This is what we're referring to as our level of assistance. So depending on the level of assistance, there are different requirements. We're going to briefly review these different requirements before we get too much into staffing and capacity and all the different phases of construction. But just to remind everybody, and then I also want to remind everybody too, this chart is not really listed in the order of doing the work. We were just trying to come up with different categories. And if you recall, we have this really handy handout, which is a pretty expansive look of the chart that we have on the slide. So this handout is available to you through the link. I believe it was posted when you were provided a link to be able to access all the materials. But just to remind you, for this first category, the up to and including 5,000, we have evaluation method. Remember, evaluation is our way of trying to determine if there's lead or lead hazards in the unit. So for up to 5 and including 5,000, we are doing, for our evaluation, we're doing paint testing, but it's paint testing of the surfaces to be disturbed. So for this first category, we're really just looking at the work area. We're not looking at the whole entire unit. We're just really focusing on the work area. So paint testing of surfaces to be disturbed. We're going to be repairing those surfaces. During that repair, we're going to use lead-safe work practices. We need to make sure that there's clearance of the work site. We don't have any ongoing maintenance unless home rental. We don't have any elevated blood lead level requirements. That's what EBLL is. But we do have notification requirements, notification of the evaluation. So after the paint testing, we would provide a notice of evaluation that says where did we find lead in that area that we're doing the work. If for some reason we don't want to do paint testing, we always have the option to do presumption. So then our next category is the 5 to 25,000, or 5,001 to 25,000, and this is where we are now expanding the area. We're looking at the entire unit. If we're in a rental situation, we're looking at the entire unit as well as common areas that are servicing the unit. So if you're in a condo, it's the unit and any common areas that are servicing the unit. And so in this case, our evaluation is a risk assessment that's going to be done by a certified risk assessor, and then paint testing of the surfaces to be disturbed. We're going to be doing for our treatment interim controls, and then we need to make sure that we have RRP firms and workers that are doing this lead hazard control of interim controls. They're going to be doing safe work practices, and they're going to be doing unit clearance. You see, this is different than the under 5, where it was work site clearance. So we're making sure we're doing unit clearance, and then we're going to be doing our evaluations as well. And then for over 25,000, we're getting into abatement. So again, we need to do our risk assessment of the entire unit. In the common areas, we're doing paint testing. And then in this area of over 25,000, we're doing abatement. We would need an abatement firm, abatement workers to do that kind of work, still doing lead safe work practices, still doing full unit clearance, as well as our notices. If for some reason we decide we don't want to do a risk assessment or testing, we can do presumption. All right, are any of you working in an insular area? All right, so insular areas are these U.S. territories, including America Samoa, Guam, Mariana Islands, Micronesia, Republic of the Marshall Islands, Republic of Palau, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. That's what we're considering the insular areas. So if you're working in an insular area, these rules are less stringent than they are in non-insular areas. The insular areas face conditions that make it an unreasonable burden to meet some of the requirements, and so you'll see that these requirements are less stringent. There are no lead hazard evaluation requirements. Remember, for our projects, in the regular part of the United States that are not considered insular areas, we have to do either paint testing or we have to do a risk assessment and paint testing. If you are in an insular area and it's less than 5,000 per unit, there is no lead hazard evaluation requirements. The lead hazard reduction requirements, how we're treating, is still the same, okay? So we are repairing any painted, disturbed, we're repairing any surfaces that are disturbed during rehab. We still need to make sure we're following lead safe work practices, and we also need to make sure that we're passing clearance of the work site before any occupants return. So this is for insular areas up to including 5,000. If you're working in an insular area and it's over 5,000 per unit, then we no longer have the two different categories where it's 5 to 25 or over 25. It's all collapsed together. So you're either under 5 or you're over 5. So insular areas over 5, you are doing a reduced evaluation. So you are now going to be doing a visual assessment. And a visual assessment is going through the unit, looking, so you have a visual part, looking to seeing if there's any deteriorated, chipping, flaking, scaling paint. There's an online free training through HUD, so you can go to HUD.gov, you can do a search for visual assessment. It takes anywhere from a half hour to 45 minutes, but you just can go through that training and you can become a certified visual assessor. So it doesn't require hours and hours of training or any special type of training. You do need to be certified, and when you finish that online training, which is free, you're able to print out a certification, has your name on it, and you can put it in your file. So someone who's trained in visual assessment or visual assessment certified still has to do a visual assessment to identify any deteriorated paint. Again, we're in insular areas over 5,000. If you do identify any deteriorated paint, you're going to do paint stabilization, and you're going to do paint stabilization on deteriorated paint and surfaces that are disturbed by rehab. So we're not doing interim controls, we're not doing abatement, we're doing paint stabilization. And paint stabilization, if you remember, it's removing loose paint and other material from the surfaces to be treated, and it's repairing any defects in the substrate of a painted surface. And the substrate is what's underneath that painted surface. So it might be wood, it might be concrete, it might be brick. So we are repairing any defects in the substrate of a painted surface that's causing the paint to deteriorate, and we're applying a new protective coating or paint. So that's what paint stabilization is. We're not doing interim controls or abatement. So again, this is a lesser type of treatment that's done in insular areas. We still need to make sure we're doing clearance. The unit and the common areas servicing those units need to pass clearance before those units can be occupied again, all right? But that's just a little special information if you're working in insular areas. All right, we saw this in Module 2, but the slide shows you what the key actors are, who the key actors are. So let's review this again. So we have our program staff, and our program staff are the staff that are administering our program. We have our homeowner intake. If you're doing a homeowner type program, you might have a rental rehab program. So any intake staff, our inspectors, compliance staff, our finance department, we're going to have a specification writer, and ideally, whether the specification writer is in-house or somebody we contract with, ideally they would be a certified risk assessor. It's not required, but it would be great to be able to have that. There's also some states that may require the work write-up to the specification work of abatement to be done by a certified abatement supervisor or a project designer. So your specification writers may need to have these special certifications, either a risk assessor or abatement supervisor if you're working in certain states for that. We do want to let you know that training is an eligible cost for most of these programs that you're administering, so you might want to check that out, probably an admin cost. But if you do feel like you need to train your staff, that could be charged to your programs. We also have, in addition to our program staff, we have our partners in doing the rehab. These are our general contractors, our painters, our plumbers, our electricians. We would like to ideally have our general contractors be RRP certified. That's our renovation, repair, and painting certification. Les talked about that last week when we were together. And then we have our lead specialists. They can be our paint inspectors, they can be risk assessors, clearance examiners. Those are different types of lead specialists. We would have trained lead contractors, abatement supervisors, RRP workers. Les talked quite a bit about these different types of lead specialists in Module 2 as well. So we may have to have our program staff help our general contractors understand the requirements that are going to apply to the type of work that they're doing. If the lead safe housing rule is triggered, we're going to have to start to use lead language in our contracts as well as in the work specifications and communications. And then our program staff is going to have to locate these lead specialists. We may need to do some type of recruiting to be able to get lead specialists in our area. And our Mod 2 slides did cover the different lead specialists and where to find them. You can go to epa.gov, and that's also another spot where you can type in what type of lead worker you need and where the area you're in or whether you need training. And through the EPA website, it'll help you find some of these specialists. All right, so we're going to walk through the typical steps of rehab and talk through how to apply the lead safe housing rule throughout. These are the different steps that are pretty common. Your program might have a few more steps, it might have less steps, but just as we go through what the different stages are, try to think about how does this relate to my program and where do I need to go back and look at my program and see if I need to change anything or do I need to implement something new to make sure that your program's meeting compliance. All right, so we're going to start off with the program application and interview. At this stage, you, the grantee, actually have opportunity to educate the owner. There's really no specific requirements at program application, but your grantee staff can provide information on the program goals and what you're trying to do as it relates to lead and reducing lead hazards. You can discuss the level of participation and the cooperation you're going to need of the owner as well as the tenants. And you can also provide the pamphlet, the Renovate Right pamphlet. The pamphlet is required to be given by the contractor, but this is a chance for you to make sure that the pamphlet's actually provided up front and early so that they're aware of what the work might be like, what kind of conditions might be existing in their home, and what some of these hazards are going to be and how you're going to protect them during this kind of work. This is also a good time for you to find out what kind of expectations does the owner have. When I used to work for a city, we had a pamphlet of what rehab was going to look like, and we were really clear that rehab does not mean remodeling, and sometimes people have in their minds what it's going to be, and it's really important to make sure that you're talking through what are the goals of your project, what's going to be paid for, what's not, what it's going to look like in the end. You also can be going through different information about occupant protection. Les is going to go into more detail about what these different parts are and how you can communicate that. There also may be temporary relocation that might be needed. So the household might need to pack up and move. And so talking about who's responsible for that, who's going to pay for that, what kind of unit do they need to be moved to. These are all different things that can be discussed or information can be provided at the interview. It's also a chance for the grantee to find out if there's been any prior lead work done on that property or on that unit. You can find out was there any previous hazards identified or any testing. You can try to obtain any records that they might have. The next phase is the property inspection and the specification documentation. And so during property inspection, the staff conducting the review to determine the work required for the program. So they're going to be going through, doing the work write-up. The scope of work is based on the rehab or repair needs of the property. So maybe, for example, you're funding your rehab program with CDBG, and maybe the focus of your CDBG program is to bring that property up to to current electrical codes. And so you think you're just going to be dealing with the electricity and dealing with all the electrical codes on this property, and now all of a sudden you're tearing walls apart, you're disturbing paint, you've triggered the lead safe housing rule, and so you're into a much bigger project than you initially thought, because now maybe you're in the $5,000 to $25,000 range and you're dealing with rehab of the whole unit rather than you just thought you had this single focus. So these are things that you need to be aware of. Some of the work can be considered rehab costs. Some can be lead hazard reduction work. If you recall last time we talked about how this cost estimate can determine what kind of level of assistance you're in, what type of workers might need to do certain types of work. So these are all different things to keep in mind when you're going through the specification section or steps. Grantees need to ensure that the person writing the specifications has the capacity or hires a risk assessor to write certain sections of the work write-up to meet HUD and EPA requirements. So again, remember we said ideally your specification writer would be a certified risk assessor. They need to be aware of the methods of lead hazard control as well as the costs. And you should also include a risk assessor if you're doing presumption. And the reason you want to do that is because you still need to have a work write-up that has a scope of work that's going to deal with how are you going to reduce those lead hazards. What is the type of work that you're doing? So if you are presuming in the 5 to 25, you're going to be doing standard treatment. If you're over 25, you're going to be abating all the applicable surfaces. So you still need to have a risk assessor help you write that scope so that you understand what standard treatments are or what abatement is and make sure that that's written up properly. Thinking through the items on the work write-up or the specifications and how it may affect the level of assistance. So perhaps you have a single-purpose program. Maybe you are just looking at plumbing or rewiring or rebuilding the porches or some type of ADA work. Maybe that's the single purpose program you have and it was always under 5,000. But now when you're looking into the work that you're doing, you are disturbing a lot more paint and you're falling into a higher category. So these are just things to think of, like what level of assistance are you going to land in once you have that initial work write-up. And then just to keep in mind, like I said, some of these items on your work write-up may fall as a hard cost in rehab, or they may count as a lead hazard reduction cost. It just depends on how your rehab program is written. So if your rehab program is designed to always address windows and always address doors and cabinets and floors, then those will be part of the rehab hard costs. If your rehab never does windows, then windows may count as a lead hazard reduction cost, and that could change and depend on what category you end up on once you determine that level of assistance. So these are just different things to keep in mind as you're going through and putting together the scope of work. Continuing on with property inspections and specifications, the evaluation part. Remember, evaluating is us determining whether there's lead in the unit or not, and if there's any lead hazard. So depending on the level of assistance, the program is going to conduct paint testing. So you would do paint testing as your evaluation if you are up to including 5,000, or if you're over 5,000, then you're going to be doing paint testing of surfaces to be disturbed and a risk assessment. So those are different levels of evaluation. Like I said earlier, you always have that option to presume lead-based paint. You may also decide to do a lead hazard screen. Now, it's very rare that we say lead hazard screens. Lead hazard screens can be done in units that are from 1960 to 1978. So units built between 1960 and 1978 could have a lead hazard screen. This is done to determine if there is lead in the unit, and if you determine that there's not, then you can just continue on. But more often than not, they do find lead, and then you end up having to do a full risk assessment. So not very many communities do the lead hazard screens because they usually end up having to pay for the lead hazard screen and then having to do a risk assessment as well. But it is an option that's available to you. You need to make sure you're using certified professionals to conduct the evaluation, so you can have paint inspectors. If you're just doing paint testing, you would have a risk assessor if you need to have a risk assessment done with paint testing. So these are approved by EPA. There's different training and certifications they need to go through. You can also certify your own staff if you decide that you don't want to contract with risk assessors or paint inspectors. It might be helpful to have a risk assessor on staff because, again, you want to make sure the work write-ups, the specifications, and the paint testing are are properly written to address lead hazards, as well as quality assurance of reports that are going to be provided to you. So some different options you have on evaluation and certifications of staff or procuring that. And then after evaluation, occupants and the owners need to receive a notice of lead hazard evaluation. So if you do the testing, or if you're in testing and risk assessment, you would provide a notice of lead hazard evaluation to the owner and occupants within 15 days of receiving the report. If you decide not to do paint testing and risk assessments, if you decide to follow the presumption, if you're deciding that you're going to presume, then you're going to do a notice of presumption. And the notice of presumption also needs to be provided to the owners and the tenants within 15 days of making that presumption. So again, you're either going to do testing and a risk assessment, depending on what category, or presumption, okay? So you're going to pick one of these or the presumption method. Okay, if you do decide to presume rather than test, you're allowed to do that, but your hazard control measures are enhanced, and it may be that it might cost more than if you had actually tested and did a risk assessment. It could cost more because potentially you could be treating areas that may not even have lead-based paint. So you have to look at your portfolio, you have to see what has been your experience. Have you had a lot of lead units, or do you not have so many lead units? So maybe it's more cost effective to do that kind of testing. You know, when the rule first came out, there was not that many risk assessors out there, so it was kind of hard to do that. So a lot of communities ended up doing presumption, but nowadays there's a lot more risk assessors with the web. It's easier to find firms, so there's a lot more testing and risk assessments being done. But it's up to you, the grantee, to decide what you want to do. If you do presume, this chart is reminding you what the actions are. So that first category up to including 5, if you're presuming, you need to do lead safe work practices and clearance for all painted surfaces, not just the surfaces to be disturbed, okay? So remember, if we were doing paint testing, it was lead safe work practices and clearances on all painted surfaces to be disturbed. If we're presuming, we've now made it a lot bigger, okay? So we're doing lead safe work practices and clearance. We're doing this repair on all painted surfaces. If we are in the 5 to 25,000 range, we're doing standard treatments to all applicable all surfaces, interior and exterior deteriorated paint, including friction and impact surfaces. So again, we're expanding the area and the work that we need to do. And if we are doing abatement, we're presuming we're abating all interior and exterior deteriorated paint, including friction and impact surfaces and soil. We are allowed to do interim controls for exterior areas that are not being disturbed by the rehab. Okay, so we're going to move on to stage 3, the contractor selection. So thinking through the process of contractor selection, most grantees typically have an RFP process, but they need to ensure that their contractors have the proper qualifications. If you're doing lead hazard control work, do your workers have RRP certification? If you're doing abatement work, do you have abatement firms and abatement workers? So we need to make sure they have the proper qualifications. They need to have the proper certifications, the paperwork, the card that says that they're certified, that has the expiration date of when that certification ends. You want to have copies of all this. You want to be checking the references. You want to be contacting former clients that they had, and how did the work go? Did it pass clearance? Did you feel that the units were properly cleaned after? Were the occupants' belongings protected properly? So you want to check these references. During this time is when the contractors would submit their bids for work, and so you, as a grantee, may want to keep a list of pre-qualified lead contractors, and then these could be notified when you had actual bid opportunities. And then you may need to recruit if you need to find more lead contractors. You could offer free RRP training, and then you do want to make sure that you're interviewing your contractors and asking for their credentials. So we're moving into the next phase of work coordination. So you may be dealing with trades coordination and scheduling. So sometimes grantees stage the work. They might need to do the lead work first, and they would do the lead work first. They'd have all the lead certified firms and contractors, depending on the type of work that needs to be done, have those proper certified firms or contractors doing the work, and then they would get an interim clearance. So they would do an interim clearance after the lead work was done, and then we would have our regular rehab contractors come in, do the rest of the rehab, and have a final clearance done, okay? So there may need to be some type of coordination depending on what the work's being done, what needs to be done, who's available to do that work. All right, so there's no special requirements in lead sites housing rule for pre-construction meetings, but it's a good idea to review these items so that everyone's on the same page. So we have our roles and expectations, who's doing what, what's going to be expected of each role. We have our work schedule. So if you're needing to coordinate the lead work versus the regular rehab work, you need to have a schedule in place, who's going to do the work first, who's going afterwards, when are we going to be doing clearance, interim clearance, final clearance in between. So work schedule is going to be really important. The responsibilities and the coordination, you know, who's going to be doing what at what time, be able to work together on that. So who's responsible and who's going to coordinate that. Then we have the work methods. So our work methods are going to be including our safe work practices. We need to be talking about setup, occupant protection, cleanup, clearance. These are all different things we might want to talk about in our pre-construction meeting about our work methods. And then there's going to be special contractual provisions, and we want to call these out. This might cover areas such as what do we do for debris disposal, or we want to make sure at the end of this project that this unit and the common areas are achieving successful clearance, and we're not going to consider this project complete, and we're not going to pay everybody until we meet successful clearance. So we want to make sure these special contractual provisions are called out and reviewed during the pre-construction conference. So that's the last slide I have in my section. Is there other areas that we should expand upon a little bit before you go into your side, or any questions you came up that we need to clarify?
I'll just mention that we had a number of questions. You had referenced the online visual assessment training, and so I have pasted that a couple of times into the Q&A, the link, but that's on the HUD.gov site. You can pull it up by just typing using their search function and put in visual assessment training, and it will come right up for you. But I also have pasted the link in to the Q&A. I think for the most part, the questions that are coming in have very detailed answers. I'm not sure we probably want to dive into those here. I'm going to suggest we go ahead and have people take a break, and then, you know, grab water, whatever you need to do, and then we'll start into the second portion of this. So I have that it's 1:42. So if we could be back at 1:52, so take a 10-minute break, and then we'll dive into the rest of this and finish out our session.
Great, thanks, Les.
All right, welcome back from your break. Luckily with our virtual trainings, there's probably no line for the restroom, so that helps a little bit. Just a couple of things I wanted to mention before we jump back into this. I noticed that there are a number of folks that are entering questions that you have into the chat box. And so the folks that are answering questions are monitoring the question and answer box. So if you look at the top right hand of your screen, there's a little blue box that says Q&A and has a little question mark on that. If you open that up and enter those questions, then someone is going to see your question about the lead-safe housing rule and be able to respond to those. I also just would say for folks that are relatively new to this and might be feeling kind of overwhelmed by all this information that you're trying to get straight in your head, you know, you probably aren't going to learn all of this and feel comfortable with it in one setting, but this will introduce you to all the concepts, give you an understanding of the framework on how decisions are made, and we're also going to then line you up with the resources where you can go back and recheck and reread the details on the next steps as you go along. So for those of you that may be feeling kind of overwhelmed, stay with it. Next time you are looking at this information, more of it is going to make sense for you. And I will mention, I think tomorrow we may try to, there seem to be a lot of questions about you know, level of evaluation, level of testing, and how we determine this level of assistance, which sets those, kind of determines what level we're going to be working in. So I would suggest look back at session 2, which you should have a link for, but we may try to pull out the chart tomorrow during the office hour session and kind of revisit that, and that may help a little bit for folks on kind of clearing some of that up. So we're going to move into talking about, as we're doing the work, how do we protect the occupants of those units? And in addition to that, we're really also talking about their possessions. So during the work being completed, we need to be present and keeping an eye on what's happening on that site. So we have, you know, laid out, Chris has been talking about, you know, determining what that scope of work is going to be based on the level, whether we're doing hazard reduction, interim controls, or whether we're actually doing abatement on that. If we were under 5,000, we might be only dealing with the paint surfaces that are disturbed. So we've kind of laid out what we expect to see on that property and who is certified to do that work, but you're going to have someone on your behalf doing some periodic inspections to make sure that that's actually what's happening on that site. And we're also going to talk quite a bit here about the clearance at the end of the project. So I know at the end of session 2, we kind of talked through that rather quickly. We're going to spend a little more time on that. So we're making sure that the staff that's actually on that project have the appropriate certifications. We're going to make sure that they are using the appropriate protective gear. Who knew a year ago that PPE would be such a familiar acronym for everyone here? So we're needing to make sure that they are following what those prescribed work was going to be, that they're not using any of the prohibitive methods that we talked about, that they are working wet. So if they're scraping things, that we're working with a moistened surface so we're not creating dust, that they're cleaning up and using a HEPA vacuum to control that dust as they are working. So we're trying to make sure that we are not creating more hazards in the way we're doing that work. Also of real concern is this containment of the work site, and we're going to spend a little bit of time on that in this section. But you know, for as much as we have a plan of work, those on-site inspections will tell you whether that's actually happening appropriately or not, whether we're containing what dust and paint chips and other debris that we're creating in that work site, whether the signage has been posted in particular there, but also thinking about those occupants. And we're going to be talking about sometimes we can keep the occupant in place, other times we need to temporarily move them off the site, but we also need to protect their possession. And so we're going to spend a little time in the section also talking about that. So as part of that on-site visit, we would be making sure that they are using appropriate equipment, that they have done appropriate containment as part of this, that we have certified workers on that site, and they're following the prescribed scope of work and methodologies that have been set in place. It's not uncommon to make a site visit and find that even though we had a very careful plan to do this in a safe and appropriate manner, that might not be followed on site. So we want to make sure that does not occur, and that it's very clear that we have appropriate levels of oversight to make sure that folks understand that's not going to be happening. So let's first, before we go into more detailed discussion about protection for occupants, let's talk a little bit about some of the resources. So we have a Safe Work Practices Renovate Right brochure that we're going to be providing, and that kind of gives the occupant some basic education, not only about the danger of lead paint, but also why the work is being done in the way it's being done, how that can be managed. So they are, as they may be observing work being done on that site in maybe some contained part of their unit, they kind of know what to look for, what they would expect to see. So they also become sort of eyes and ears for you. But part of that brochure also provides some information about ongoing, how they as a homeowner, on how they maintain and clean that unit can ensure that they continue to have control those potential lead hazards that would put their family, and particularly the children, at risk. I'll point out, and Chris mentioned this, I think, last week, that there is interpretive guidance, and these are active links for you. So there are some specific guidance about lead-safe units, and we're going to be talking in a minute when we talk about moving folks to a temporary unit while work is being done in their unit, that those need to be lead-safe units. So we're going to be doing a visual inspection. We're going to be doing dust wipes to make sure that those are appropriate settings to move that family into. And we'll be talking a little bit more about interim clearance and particularly about elderly consent. And then as we go through this, there are a whole number of forms and checklists. Many of these are not required, but they're helpful to you in kind of using as a guide to remember what questions you need to ask. So, for instance, the post-work checklist would walk you through, okay, what are all the things that we said needed to be handled? Have each of these been handled? That would include the occupant protections as part of this. And then in particular, in the HUD guidelines, Chapter 8 focuses on resident protections, worksite preparation, goes into a great deal of detail. So that becomes sort of the Bible to go to when you need more detail. So I mentioned earlier, for those of you that are, well, really for all of us, we're not going to hold all of this in our head. And so being familiar with where those resources are and where we can go to sort of check our knowledge, remind ourselves of what the rules are, what the best practices are. These become really important resources for us. So we have some visuals here, and we just kind of want you to think about, so this is sort of like a Where's Waldo sort of thing, but take a look at this graphic and think about where are some of the unsafe conditions in the illustration. Just take a minute or so, and then we'll kind of talk through this as a group. So I think as we look at this graphic, there's just a whole number of things that clearly would not be ideal if we have lead hazard reduction work or abatement work happening in this unit. First of all, we've got a window that's open So we've got a breeze that's blowing in. So as we disturb any lead-covered surface, we're going to then be distributing that dust all over the place. And one of our primary goals here is to try to contain and then be able to clean that lead residue that would be generated by the work that we are doing here. Looks like there's, I don't know, a mirror or something that's by the window. So we've actually apparently broken something that is owned by the occupant. And it looks like we've just set up work right there in the middle of the living room. We've got a child's toy on the floor. So all of these are huge red flags about, contamination. We've got an upholstered chair and a rug that are not going to be cleanable surfaces that we are probably getting lead dust and other contaminants onto. The doorway is open to the next adjoining space, so we're not containing any of that. We've got a broom sitting there. So, we just talked about using HEPA vacuums and things, so it doesn't look like they're using that technology. So, these are the sort of eyeball tests that as we're doing an inspection of a workplace that we're going to be looking for and making sure that we are not seeing any of those indicators. Next, we've got a visual for the exterior of the house. And take another minute and try to look at this one also. So you might think that this would not be a real-life scenario, but as a former state administrator, I can think of a couple of cases that are very similar. We've got somebody on the exterior working on, looks like grinding or sanding away on paint, but we've got windows open. So we've got, the contamination. We're not containing that dust and keeping it from penetrating into the house. We've got folks with their heads out the window. We've got children playing. We don't have anything that's going to capture anything that's falling to the ground, so we're probably contaminating vegetation and the soil at that point. I'm kind of thinking that the way that ladder is propped up is probably not a good idea either. And so just all of these are real bad indicators that we want to make sure we're not going to actually see when we look on site. And then lastly, we've got an interior shot of a worker on site. And so again, as you look at this, you see we've got an open window. So we've got a breeze that's helping us to distribute lead dust and debris all over the place. We've got the owner's possessions, including surfaces that are not going to be cleanable. So we're going to be contaminating things that we will not be able to then clear of that contamination. We've got a person using a belt sander, which would be prohibited. We've done nothing to protect that person's possession on that. And of course, as we mentioned, we've got the breeze blowing, spreading our contamination all over the place. So let's talk specifically about owner protections. And you'll notice this is not only talking about protecting, let's get my pen here, not only the occupant, but we're going to be also talking about their belongings. And so, one of our keys here, as we're doing lead reduction, hazard reduction work or abatement, we're trying to make sure that our work itself is not creating additional hazards that we are not going to be able to deal with and clear at the end of that process. So part of our evaluation of the project and the work is to try to determine can that owner continue to occupy that unit while we're completing that work, and what about their belongings? Where are our work areas going to be? Where is our access to that work area going to be? So where are we maybe tracking in and out of, and then making sure that their belongings are also cleared from that. So that becomes part of our planning process, collecting information to determine that we are taking appropriate actions in place. So we're going to be talking about times when we may need to temporarily relocate someone, and some scenarios where we may be able to leave that person in place, and the steps and procedures that we're going to be taking. So relocation is going to be required when to keep those tenants safe, the occupant of that unit, that we need to remove them from the site. So there's not a way to keep them in place and maintain safety. And so we're going to temporarily move them from that site, and we will not be allowing them to return until clearance has been achieved. So it's not just that we've completed the work for the day and we've swept it up, done some cleaning, but we're going to do clearance. So we're doing a scientific testing to determine, is it actually safe for folks to be able to return to that site. In some cases, let's say we have done testing and we find that maybe there's only one room on the interior of the house that has lead hazard. So we might be able to leave folks in place, but for them to be able to be in place with some restriction, they need to have access to kitchens and bathrooms, and we can't ask them to simply be out of that unit for more than an 8-hour day. So if they can't return at the conclusion of an 8-hour day with clearance being achieved and have access to necessary components of that unit, such as kitchens and bathrooms, then it's not going to be appropriate to leave them in place while we're doing the work, and so they're going to be need to be relocated. We're going to be talking about, so how do we pay for this? Is this optional? So up front, the program needs to be figuring out, how will we be paying for relocation? We're going to mention that under Uniform Relocation Act, if we are involuntarily displacing someone, such as a tenant who occupies a unit that we're doing work on, we're going to be fully covering all of their costs, all of their out-of-pocket costs. Those will be borne by the program itself. If we have owner occupants that are voluntarily participating in this, we might be saying to them, okay, that's going to be something that you have to pay for, the owner, but it may be that logically to get things done for your program, it may be that you want to have some assistance in place for that. So let's talk about when relocation is not required. So we may have a project that we're not going to disturb any paint. We used examples before of, maybe we were doing a roof and we weren't disturbing any fascia or other surrounding painted surfaces. Maybe we are replacing the HVAC system, and so we're not actually disturbing painted surfaces, or we may have, as we mentioned, interior work that can be completed within a 1 8-hour work day. And so we can ask those tenants to go somewhere else for the day. Those occupants will be gone. We'll be protecting their possessions. We'll complete our work, do the cleaning, have an acceptable clearance level documented, and then be able to allow them to return at the end of the day. We may have projects where we find that all of the work is on the exterior, and we're going to appropriately seal off so that we won't inadvertently, cause dust or other contamination to enter into the interior of that property. So we could then allow those occupants to remain in place. As we mentioned, we may have projects that, because of where our scope of work is limited to some specific areas, that maybe have the ability to cordon off or seal off those work areas and allow the occupants to continue to occupy that unit. Now, keep in mind, they need to have access to sleeping areas, bathrooms, kitchens. The maximum for this time period of working with them on site with these field areas is going to be 5 calendar days. And you as a program may be looking at that and say, you know, given the household occupants, maybe we've got a family with small children, and there's some concern about, you know, will they actually in after work hours stay out of the field areas? You can make a program decision about maybe we're going to be cautious and go ahead and relocate the household. But this is the condition when you have the option to not relocate. Also, if we have elderly occupants who have signed a consent, so they have said, I'm okay with remaining on site, we are still going to try to make sure that they're protected. And we're also thinking about their possessions in the work area and making sure that we are not causing additional contamination. So as I mentioned, when we think about appropriate temporary unit, you know, if this is something that's going to be completed in just a couple of days, we may be paying for that household to be staying in a local hotel or motel. If that unit that they're going to stay in has cooking facilities and equipment, we may be able to simply provide the housing, the nights of housing on that. In a lot of cases, they won't really have full facilities to be able to prepare meals, and so we would also provide meal vouchers for them. And really, the length of time that we're dealing with is going to prescribe, you know, how long, what kind of facility is going to be appropriate for them. If we had someone that needed to be out for a more extended period of time, then maybe something like renting an apartment would be more appropriate for them. Many times we're going to be working in a multi-family, multi-unit structure where we may be able to sort of do what we call checkerboarding, where we treat some of the vacant units and then move people out of their units into a treated unit. And once their unit has been completed, maybe move them back. Maybe we're going to leave them in that treated unit, complete their unit, and then move another household. So we would have a plan for moving folks and keeping them safe on that. So as I mentioned, the standard for those temporary units is that they must be found to be lead safe. So we're going to do a visual assessment looking for unstable paint surfaces, and then we'll also be doing a dust wipe to make sure that we have appropriate level of contamination there. So sometimes it may be that for a project we're going to be looking for units that were built after 1978, so we can say, you know, this should be a lead-free unit that we're going to temporarily place folks into. So I mentioned this before. For those of you that are not dealt with Uniform Relocation Act, this is a federal requirement that protects the occupants of units when there is federal work being done. And generally, the rule of thumb is that anytime this is something that they are involuntarily part of, then Uniform Relocation Act is going to put in specific protections. And so we would be paying if they need to be moved either permanently or temporarily. The program is going to pay those costs, including, you know, moving their possessions, moving them back, utility connections, those sorts of things. So for a lot of the work that we are doing with our lead hazard reduction and abatement activities, we're going to have a mix. In some cases, we're going to have a tenant. They are not voluntarily signing up for this. The owner of the property is, and so they are going to be covered under Uniform Relocation Act. And so you will have to follow the prescriptive requirements under the URA, which requires that all of the out-of-pocket expenses would be covered. That would be temporary housing. If there's maybe temporary storage there for their possessions, all of that would need to be covered. So that's a program cost that would need to be incorporated into your budget. There is a HUD handbook, 1378, which is really helpful on that. So for what we would call involuntary, are when we're talking about owner occupants. So they voluntarily might be signing up for your housing rehabilitation program. So they're not being forced to participate in this. So this actually does not trigger Uniform Relocation Act, but you're not required to pay the URA benefits and pay for all those out-of-pocket expenses. So you as a program need to determine, what's going to work for us. You probably, in many cases, need those occupants out of that unit. We're dealing with low-income folks. That may be a burden for them to stay somewhere else while that rehab is being done. So you do have the ability to put in place what is called an optional relocation plan. So that means that this is not something that's triggering Uniform Relocation Act, which really calls out specifics of what you have to provide. So you could adopt an optional relocation plan, and that would lay out, we're going to pay up to a certain amount per night for stays in a motel, maybe of a maximum number of nights. Maybe as part of that you say, there are programs that would say you're going to have to find somewhere else to stay, so friends or family, but we will pay to store your possessions. So this is optional. You, as part of your program design, would be laying out what's going to be done with that. But the key here is that even though it might be not triggering Uniform Relocation Act, legislative housing rule is requiring you to protect those occupants and their possessions. So it's not optional to make sure that those protections are in place. What's optional is it's not triggering the specific requirements under Uniform Relocation Act. So a lot of planning on this and making sure that we have appropriate protection for those occupants of those units. So let's move on to step 7, which is then thinking about when the work has been completed, determining when it has been done acceptably, and not only when it's time for those occupants to be able to return to the site, but also when we're going to be willing to pay. So prior to our final clearance, the grantee is going to have to make sure that all of the work has been completed. And so when we talk about a clearance activity, we're having clearance testing done to make sure that the lead levels themselves are acceptable, but that does not go through and look at the scope of work and make sure that everything that was included in that has actually been completed and that it was done to the specifications that were required. So the program itself and the staff that's working on their behalf need to make sure that that work is inspected, that it's done appropriately, and it's found to be satisfactory. So that on-site inspection would be completed. We also need to make sure, so we're making sure that all of those hazard reduction measures that we included in the specifications, that they've been completed, but also trying to make sure that the cleanup has been completed. So we'd be looking for visual evidence that it looks like they haven't done any cleaning, that there's a lot of dust, there's debris still in place. So we would not be bringing in our clearance testing when we're visually seeing, even before doing more scientific testing, that site's not ready for that final test. As part of that, keep in mind that our inspectors are going in and out of that work site, and so our inspectors need to make sure that they are not then tracking, maybe they're going into a contained area and then coming out of that. We want to make sure that they are not tracking any lead contaminants into the rest of that unit. They may be on site at the point where we have some sections that, or all of it, that has been completed, that cleaning has been done, but the testing has yet to be done. So our inspectors themselves need to be careful that they're not causing contamination on this. And then something that's important to know about on timing on this is that we can't do that clearance testing until at least, at a minimum, an hour after all of the work has been completed and that cleaning has been done. Why would we have that rule in place? Well, one of the things that we're particularly looking for is the presence of lead dust. And so it kind of goes back to that old cliche, but we may have to wait for the dust to settle on this project. And so as a minimum, we're waiting at least an hour to make sure that, you know, if we have any contaminants that are still floating around in the air, we want to make sure that those have settled so that we're actually getting an accurate read on that and making sure so we need to wait a little time on that. So for instance, when we were talking about, well, if we could complete the work within an 8-hour work day, we could leave the occupants in place. That includes the clearance testing. And so we have to time into that. We have at least an hour once all of the work has been done in our cleanup to make sure that all of the dust is settled and so that we'll have accurate testing on that. So that kind of factors into our timeline a bit for that project. So our clearance test is going to have to be completed before we can say, yes, this project has been completed, that yes, we've now attained these acceptable levels. And so that's really a combination of visual, as I mentioned, where we're looking for evidence that we still don't have a clean work site. We're making sure, our inspectors are making sure that all the work that was part of our specifications have been completed, that they followed appropriate methodologies that we required. And then we're going to have a quantitative environmental evaluation done. So we're going to be taking dust samples throughout our work area. So we're taking samples to see what contamination still remains. If you're not familiar with Chapter 15 of the guidelines, I mentioned this is really the go-to source for all the details. Chapter 15 has really good details about the clearance process, the sampling and testing process, and there is a clearance report review worksheet. So you're going to, once that clearance testing has been done, a clearance report will be issued, and this review worksheet is essentially walking you through the things you need to look at as you are reviewing that clearance report to determine, have we actually attained an acceptable level of clearance on this project, or will we be needing to require that additional work to be done? So we need to make sure that the folks that are actually doing the clearance testing are an independent third party. So we mentioned, I think last week when we talked about the difference between the EPA requirements and the HUD rule requirements, is that this clearance requirements under the HUD rule are more stringent. So EPA would actually allow the contractor themselves to do some quick wipes based on the color change to determine whether, you know, they'd actually met acceptable hazard reduction levels. The HUD rule is more stringent, requires a third party that's not, you know, have a conflict of interest, so they're not part of that lead reduction team that has done the work, and so they are, you know, collecting these samples, and they are going to then have them independently analyzed to determine the levels that were attained and whether that was acceptable. So for our clearance testing, there would be a protocol that would be defined of, you know, how many samples are we going to take? Where will those samples be taken from? That would not be something that we would provide to the lead contractor so that they knew, oh, they're going to test in these 5 spots. I'm going to clean those 5 spots really carefully and not worry about the rest of this. These are going to be samples that are taken by that third-party testing just to try to make sure that we now have a safe environment for that occupant to return, and that it's appropriate for us to then sign off as this is a completed project. So who's going to conduct the clearance examination? So if the project involved abatement, and we're using the EPA definition on this, then we need to have a certified risk assessor or certified lead-based paint inspector on that. So part of our planning, again, is to make sure we have appropriate staffing on this. We may be hiring out those particular aspects of the project. And then for projects that are covered by the lead safe housing rule and where we're talking of non-abatement work, this can be, the clearance testing can be done by a certified risk assessor or a lead-based paint inspector, or if we had a certified sampling technician in the area. For the most part, we're not familiar with there being very many certified sampling technicians out there. As Chris mentioned in her section, we have a number of states that have more stringent requirements, and so you always need to make sure as a program that you also are checking to see what the state program requirements are, and if they are more stringent than the HUD lead safe housing rule, then you would need to follow the more stringent of those two rules. So consistent with what we've been talking about throughout this process, we're always going to provide notification and documentation for occupants, and also in our files, we're going to maintain this. So we're going to make sure that the occupant is receiving that notice of hazard reduction. And that's going to, there's a standard notice that includes contact information and the date of that notice. It's going to list out and identify what those hazard reduction activities were, and then it will show what the results were, including those clearance results. And so we might get a clearance report back that said, we tested in 11 areas, and maybe 10 of those areas were found to be acceptable. If we find that we have an unacceptable area, we're going to be sending them back. A lot of times it's simply a re-cleaning of that area and then a retesting. But at the point we finally have an acceptable level and we are going to consider this clean, then we're going to be notifying the occupants and providing those clearance results on that. We have a time constraint on that. We need to have that sent within 15 days of completion of the hazard reduction work. I think there was a question in the earlier session about, well, what if we are doing a presumption on this? We, again, would be sending out a notice within 15 days of when we have completed that hazard reduction work to notify them about the clearance levels that were attained. And so at the point that we have finally met acceptable levels with our clearance testing, that we would then be able to consider this project to be completed. And that would be at the point when a contractor would be eligible to be paid. We certainly would not want to pay for lead hazard reduction work or abatement work prior to that clearance having been attained, because we're going to need to require them to go back in and keep addressing hazards until we get them to an acceptable level on that project. So for the contents of the abatement and clearance report, some standard requirements here. We need a date. We need a name and address of who is actually performing this clearance examination. We're going to have information about not only the visual results, but also our dust sample results on that, who actually did the testing on that. So we talked about it needing to be a scientific analysis on that. We're going to be working with a laboratory on that. And this would include information about the start and completion dates of the hazard reduction work, the firm that was completing that, the supervisor that was assigned as part of that, and then essentially detailing the work that was completed and obviously the clearance information that went with that. If we're dealing with abatement, then again, we're going to be specifying, because our scope of work is going to be different, for abatement, we're going to be listing out similarly the same information, maybe including soil analysis if that's applicable, and then listing out the abatement firm and the supervisor, and any occupant protection plan that was in place as part of that, and really providing the details on that. That's not only going to be important, we're providing that to an occupant, but the owner, and that might be that you own the structure. We're going to need that in our records because ongoing, we're going to have to determine, does this property still include lead? Will we continue to provide tenants with our disclosure forms? And then we're going to be talking at the end of this section about, in some cases, we're going to need to oversee some ongoing maintenance. So we need to be very clear on what work was done, what lead hazards may remain on that property, so that we can track that over time on that. So some resources that you may find helpful as part of that. There's a post-construction safe work practices certification. So these are kind of checklists and certifications once that work has been completed that are being signed off by the contractor. We have provided a sample clearance report, and then there's a worksheet for if I'm reviewing that clearance report, walk me through the things that I should be checking to make sure that that report actually contains as part of that. And then similarly for abatement, we have a review worksheet. And then there's a sample notice for lead hazard reduction for that. All right, so let's kind of switch gears. We've talked about completing the rehab, and we define completion based on the fact that we have gone through a clearance process. We've had a third party that not only did a visual inspection, but also are essentially a scientific clearance to analyze the dust particles that are remaining to make sure that we've actually attained acceptable levels of hazards that are remaining. So some of our projects, as I mentioned, are going to trigger some requirements beyond completion of just the rehab that we're doing for that project. So specifically, the way the rules are laid out, this is for property owners that have an ongoing relationship. Essentially, this is going to be determined by the funding source. So the key example we're going to be looking at today are rental units that have home funds in them. So the home program has a defined affordability period. There are ongoing property standard requirements as part of those program requirements. And so as part of that ongoing oversight and property standards, they have to incorporate lead-based paint maintenance activities as part of their building operation. And so that's going to include a visual assessment for deteriorated paint, but it also would be bare soil. And then keep in mind, when we've done a hazard reduction, and in some cases actually abatement, we will not have removed the lead paint from that structure, but we may have encapsulated it, or we may have enclosed it with some kind of mechanically fastened covering on that. We need to make sure that those remain in place. So for instance, let's say we have a multi-family rental project, and maybe within all units we have a couple of spots where we've done some kind of encapsulation product. Not we've just painted over with regular paint, but we've used an approved encapsulant. And maybe we have some exterior places in common areas where we have used some kind of enclosure to cover over to make sure that that is going to continue to not pose a lead hazard. We need to make sure that those haven't been removed or damaged in some way that's going to have that not continue to be a lead-safe environment. And so that a visual assessment is required. And here's the key. It has to be at unit turnover, but also every 12 months. So we might have a tenant that moved in, and at unit turnover, we're going to inspect that unit. They might be there for 6 years, or you might think, well, gee, I don't have to look at this until that unit turns over. No, it's going to be every 12 months. And so we would be going back and doing a visual assessment to ensure that that was in place. We might, as part of that visual assessment, then notice that maybe our enclosure has been removed. We might determine that we are seeing visual evidence of unstable painted surfaces, dust accumulation, bare soil, and in those cases, then we're going to need to take appropriate steps to then address that. So the owner needs to request in writing also that rental occupants monitor those lead-based paint surfaces. So in many cases, that is something that's part of their notification process where they're giving them a move-in, but it may also be something that's incorporated into their lease. So we want them to be an advocate for their own safety and be keeping an eye out within their unit, within common areas, and they would notify that owner of, hey, you know, I've got some chipping, peeling paint in my unit. I want to know, I want you to take appropriate action. That might be testing to determine maybe this isn't lead paint, but if it is lead paint, that we're going to follow the requirements under lead safe housing rule on how that's going to be addressed. In some cases, we may have a property that an inspection has determined that there's no lead-based paint present in that property. We may have a clearance report that indicates that all the lead-based paint has been removed. In those cases, that property would be exempt from ongoing lead-based paint maintenance practices, but you're going to need to have that documentation in place to show this is why I'm not following these ongoing requirements, because I am actually exempt from this, and here's my basis for that. I will tell you, I had a project years ago that we went to. It was a pre-1978 building. We were doing monitoring for home. There was no evidence that they were providing any notification to tenants as they were moving in. And they said to us, well, I think that our building was found to be lead-free. After some real digging, they were able to produce the documents that were needed to be able to document that, yes, they actually were exempt from those ongoing requirements. So, you know, we're used to having files that get disposed of at a particular point. Building files that would include this kind of information are something you're going to want to maintain and make sure that it's not part of your file disposition plan. You need those available to you long term. So when we talk about ongoing maintenance, what are we doing here? Well, we're making sure that if there's any lead-based paint that's remaining after abatement, that we're going to make sure that that's part of our ongoing operation. So we want to have the documentation of what was the scope of work that was done, and so also the testing. So where do we know that we have lead-based paint that still remains in that property? And so we would be using that as our guide of when we're doing our visual assessment of that property. We would be particularly keeping an eye on those. Again, as we said, if we had some kind of encapsulation or enclosure that was done, we'd want to use those as being on our checklist of places we need to inspect, places we need to make sure that we continue to check at unit turnover or at our annual basis. And so prior to the execution of a lease, we're going to continue to provide those disclosures, and that's not only going to inform them about the hazards of lead paint and how they can, steps they can take to protect their family, but also we're going to tell them about what's been done. What do we know about that unit that you are thinking about leasing? and be able to disclose that testing and clearance results for that unit. So we need to make sure that those initial lead reduction or abatement work files are maintained. They're kept for all of those units, and they're going to be part of laying out what's our inspection protocol going to be for those units. So as I mentioned, we're doing a visual inspection. This is both interior and exterior surfaces. This would also include common areas. So it's not just residential units, but it's the whole property and making sure that that environment continues to be safe. If we see that we have bare soil, we would be treating that. So we talked about things like planting grass, covering with mulch, so that we protect exposure to that bare soil. But we could also be testing soil and determining whether it actually had lead hazards within that. We're also going to make sure that any maintenance or renovation work that's completed, that we're going to continue to use those safe work practices. And again, the key here is anything that we're doing on this property, we want to make sure that we are not causing disturbance of lead-based paint, and we are going to, anytime we are doing maintenance or renovation work, we're going to follow the requirements for when we are required to have clearance on that. So we might, under de minimis, not be required to do testing on some of our surfaces, but we're going to continue to follow those requirements. Then I mentioned a couple times this issue about where we have encapsulation or enclosures, particularly on a rental property. We may see a lot of wear and tear on that, but we also sometimes see where some kind of subsequent property improvements were done, and they weren't really thinking about, something that they were removing and upgrading actually was put in place as part of containment for lead hazard. And so we need to make sure that part of our inspection keeps an eye on those encapsulations and enclosures to make sure that they continue to function as they were required to do. So thinking about the steps for compliance, what steps do you need to have in place to make sure that you're set to be able to do this? Well, we've been mentioning a whole number of resources. There's a lead toolkit, and some of these are in the process of being updated. And so we will, I think, continue to see some additions or some updates to that toolkit. Part 24, Part 35 includes the details of what the requirements are for compliance, but we've been talking through them as we go. You're required to have contractors that meet the requirements for the level of work that they're doing, whether they're doing interim controls, whether they are doing abatement. You need to have program procedures that include all of these requirements. So for instance, we talked about, how do we properly protect owners' possession, occupants' protection? Do we need to relocate folks out of that? We need to make sure that we've incorporated procedures so that we are planning and analyzing which of these properties those steps need to take. So, we've been going through our process on, how do we calculate the level of assistance, so defining that level of evaluation, level of testing that needs to be done. We've talked about timing requirements on notification. So all of that needs to be incorporated into our procedures, our program design. And so that may include some training. We need to make sure, even frankly, the folks that are not actually doing this, but are going to be overseeing others that are, they need to know what the applicable requirements are. So probably many of you in this, participating in this training, may not directly be doing the clearance, but you need to understand what those requirements are, so that the contract with, a third-party clearance entity that you're using, you need to understand what are the requirements, what needs to be incorporated into that contract. What am I looking for in documentation in that file? What do I need in place before I'm going to pay the invoice for an abatement contract or a lead hazard reduction work that's been completed? So everybody's going to need an appropriate level of training. Some of those are folks that are trained that you're going to hire. Others will be internal staff, and there are training resources that we've talked about, and that may be an ongoing need. Outreach needs, we talked about kind of planning for making sure that we had appropriate skills and staffing. We need an adequate pool of certified contractors. And so we may be actually doing some recruitment to get contractors on our list. So when we're doing procurement and we're making sure we have a competitive process, we've got an adequate supply to have a competitive process and, you know, to be able to complete the level of work that we need to do. One of the points, as I mentioned, about our training is to make sure that folks know about the resources that are available, where to find information that they need, and have essentially determined for their program to effectively maintain compliance, follow each of the required steps. You know, what do they have to have in place, and sort of a to-do list on that. And then, you know, we talked today about this monitoring. And so this is not only internally in making sure that the protocols and procedures that you've laid out for your own staff are being followed, that we have appropriate notification, that you have appropriate timing on disclosures, and all of that is being captured in the file. But then we also talked about, you know, you might be funding a sub-grantee who's going to be operating a program on your behalf. We may be funding a project and the owner themselves is going to be contracting for some of this work to be done. So we need to make sure that all these protocols are being followed. And I mentioned in my section a little earlier about, you know, the need to go on site and be able to sample and make sure that, yeah, when I go to the site, I actually see them following all of prescribed appropriate containment and cleaning that's being done, so that they make sure that they maintain this work site in a safe manner, so that we're going to protect not only the occupants and their possessions, but that property, to make sure that we can actually, at the completion of our project, bring all of that down to an acceptable level of lead contamination. So we've accomplished our goal of reducing the lead hazard in that site. So as part of achieving that staff capacity, as I mentioned, it might be internally, might be you or subrecipients. And, you know, this training series may be a very good first step on this, but you might be sending staff off for additional training. I will say, when I worked at the state level, we sent all of our staff off to risk assessor training, because we felt that they really needed to know as much as possible of what our subrecipients needed to be doing on running those projects appropriately. Keep in mind that in many cases we're going to have federal procurement requirements, and so as we mentioned, I think last week, you may be issuing a request for proposal or request for qualification, and need to allow adequate timing. If we're going to procure and hire some of that capacity, we need to make sure that we've kind of timed it so that it's in place. And then determine, you know, who's going to be handling things like the visual assessment, the risk assessment. We talked about needing a third-party clearance testing that's going to be done. And then simple things like we talked about, you know, within 15 days, a notice of disclosure needed to be provided. Who's going to be responsible for doing that? And then when we have things such as, we talked about temporary relocation, need to be on site and doing some oversight on construction, We talked about ongoing monitoring for our home rental properties. We need to think about, okay, how are we going to staff those? Who's going to be responsible? Do they need some additional training? So as part of that, making sure we have appropriate staffing, met their training needs, have a timetable in place, and figuring out budgeting for making sure all of that will be in place for us. So as part of that, then laying out some procedures of your internal oversight and monitoring, and that would not only be your internal operations, but field operations. So whether that's a grantee, sub-grantee, whether it's a contractor working on your behalf, making sure that you know what's actually being done, that the file, a lot of what we've been talking about is the importance of having good documentation, making sure that that's actually, you've defined what needs to be in place and it's actually being collected, that we've got appropriate protocols in place for dealing with things like contractor invoices, the documentation that will be required as part of that. Either you're going to be doing some periodic monitoring, or maybe you're using a third party to be able to do that. You may also need to be thinking about, what electronic transmission of documents or video inspections, and that may be particularly at a point where our on-site travel is being limited based on COVID risks, may be something really important to define. And then again, that key point of, unless you have all the documentation, including the clearance that you need, you're not going to be issuing payment. That's kind of your last, as long as you control the money, you have the ability to require them to go back. There is Chapter 24 of the guide does cover monitoring, and I would really recommend that you familiarize yourself with that. So we've talked about the monitoring aspects, making sure we have appropriate knowledge and training for staff, let's say work practices, and then we've kind of covered occupant protection. And in each of these, there is additional guidance that's available for you in some of the resources that we've been pointing out. Let's just revisit those resources that we've mentioned. So here again is our OLHCHH lead-based paint landing page, which has a great many resources that are available for you. Links on the bottom of the page. I would think you want to have that saved as one of your favorites. We also have the home page for Healthy Homes, the lead regulations. Here, training will be posted or is posted for lead safe housing rule on the OLHCHH. Here's the EPA site. And then Chris mentioned last week the lead compliance advisor, which can be a helpful kind of guide you through that. Some definitions about lead-based paint, and then the HUD guidelines, which we've been mentioning. We've been taking questions throughout this series, and we will be gathering tomorrow to go through more questions. But once this series has been completed, here is our link for contacting HUD to ask additional questions. So just as a reminder, as we close things out for today, next week we're going to be then talking about Subpart K. So this is essentially our non-rehab or rehab that's less than $5,000. So we're going to be talking about activities that are acquisition, leasing, support services, and operation programs. So you will see, for those of you that are participating in that, some very different requirements under Subpart K. So if you are doing any activities that include that, very important that you participate. As always, tomorrow, our office hour, we'll be starting out reviewing the homework, and as Chris mentioned, we need you to go through that in advance. And that kind of tests some of the things that we've covered in today's session. And we will also be spending some time going over some of these common questions that folks are having, but you can also bring questions to that session that we've been unable to get to providing you an answer in today's session. Chris, we have just a couple of minutes left. Anything that we want to try to take on in this, or any other reminders for folks?
I think you covered all the reminders. There was quite a bit of discussion going on in the Q&As. People were not aware that if it was an elderly household that they could provide consent after they were made aware of any potential dangers if they decided not to relocate. But we did clarify in the Q&A it had to be the entire household that was elderly, not just the head of household, in order to have that consent. And some people say, oh, I've never heard of that. It's in the interpretive guidance. We've put the interpretive guidance link in the chat and in the Q&As a whole bunch of times. And it's J24 in the interpretive guidance. And it's like a page and a half, that J24, but it's the last paragraph under that section that talks about the elderly consent for not having to relocate. There was also quite a bit of discussion about, well, what if we have these temporary relocation policies in place and the family decides they just want to go stay at grandma's house? You know, do they have to follow our policies? And we said, well, that's okay that they go stay with family, but you as the grantee still need to make sure that grandma's house is lead safe. And Les talked about the two different ways that it's lead safe. It's either got to be pre-78, and if it's not pre-78, you have to do clearance. And clearance was the combination. We talked about clearance last time we were all together, but it's the combination of a visual as well as dust wipe samples. And it has to be done by a risk assessor, a paint inspector, or a clearance technician. So you still need a certified person to do this clearance of grandma's house. Sometimes it might just be easier for them to follow your procedures, take the money, and stay at the hotel for a couple nights. So I know we'll review some of this again, but there was just quite a bit of discussion. I felt the need to bring that back up again. Go ahead, Les.
I'm glad you did. The only other thing I would throw out there is, even in a case where you have an elderly household and we're able to allow them to remain in place once we've disclosed and they sign off on that, logistically, in looking at the work that's proposed and dealing with the occupants in place and the possessions that would need to be accessible for them, in some cases, I think you also are going to decide, even though it's not required, it's going to make the job go faster and it's going to be easier. And so I think there are lots of times that it might not be required, but it's just going to make life easier. So, keep that in mind as something to consider as part of that. That brings us to 3 o'clock. So I think we should probably thank folks at this point and encourage you to join us tomorrow for our office hour session and next week for our Subpart